By 1965, the Rolling Stones had 4 singles that had reached number 1, but their latest single, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, had brought them international success. The song had not just been a hit in England, it hit number 1 in the US charts too. At this time, the band had hired Alan Klein as their manager. Klein was known for his extremely aggressive business style. His negotiating routine, it was said, would have raised eyebrows in a mafia den. He would proudly tell his clients, "Someone needs to give these guys some of their shit back." One newspaper referred to him as the toughest wheeler dealer in the pop jungle. Mick Jagger found his gangster-like reputation as attractive, and the man who once sued his own lawyer was hired. At this time, the Stones were due to renegotiate their record deal, and they brought Klein to represent them. Dressed all in black and wearing black sunglasses, the Stones sat in the meeting and watched Klein as he raged at the company chairman. He shouted, "You've been f***ing us over." An hour later, the band left the meeting over £1 million richer. They were now receiving more royalties for their songs than the Beatles, and better still, Klein had negotiated a lump sum of the money to be paid up front. With their newfound wealth, the group bought country homes and new cars. Though financially and musically they were breaking new grounds, the band were divided. Keith thought Brian's drug and alcohol consumption was destroying him, and Brian thought Keith had got together with Mick to take over his band. They were both right. Anita Pallenberg, a model and actress who spoke 6 different languages, began a relationship with Brian. When she first saw him backstage, she tapped him on the shoulder and had a big smile ready for when he turned around. But when he did, Anita was shocked. He was extremely upset and on the verge of tears. At first, Anita thought it was her fault, but she soon saw Brian had lots of issues. He explained to her how Mick and Keith had teamed up on him. He was like a hurt child, and Anita felt so sorry for him. After that, they spent the night together. Nothing happened though. Brian was in an awful state. He cried in Anita's arms all night. A month later, the Stones played at the ABC in Northampton. At one point, a fan threw a chair leg at the stage which knocked Keith Richards out cold. He collapsed at Mick's feet and the show was temporarily stopped. Brian laughed hysterically, and after sitting backstage for a while, Keith returned to finish the show. Brian's detachment from the band had been showing for a while. He told everyone he thought the new Jagger Richards songs were a drag and listened to nothing but Beatles songs at home. No one ever heard him play a Stones record. On their next US tour, Alan Klein paid for a 100-foot illuminated billboard of their faces to loom over Times Square in New York. He also estimated their tour would bring in $1.5 million. Brian announced they might give their money to the Black Panthers or any other radical group. They never did. When they reached Montreal, Keith couldn't find his passport, and so the group had to sneak him through immigration. At this point, Brian began using acid heavily. Anita later stated, "He saw creatures coming out the ground, the walls, the floors. He was looking in cupboards for people." Brian suffered terrible mood swings. He reached manic highs and devastating lows. One night while performing the last time, Keith collapsed on stage and stayed down for 7 minutes. There was a deathly silence from the crowd and a sense of dread. Keith eventually got up unfazed and asked, "What do I do for an encore?" In the spring of 1966, the Rolling Stones released their first album comprising entirely of Jagger Richards songs. It had been recorded in a windowless studio called RCA in California. Most of the songs had been written on their previous tour. that had originally been written as a soundtrack for a film titled Back, Behind and In Front. But when Mick met the director, he didn't like him, so the idea was scrapped. Anita Pallenberg had restored Brian's motivation to record music, as much as it could be restored, and one day with George Harrison, Brian began learning sitar. He loved the Beatles' Rubber Soul album, especially the song Norwegian Wood. Within an hour of playing, he was figuring out melodies. Jones would literally transform songs with one instrument. That was how powerful his playing was. When a music journalist visited the sessions, she was shocked at how cruel the band treated Brian. Though he was peaking in creativity, Brian would often be intoxicated or not show up. His unprofessional attitude annoyed Keith Richards. Virtually all of the guitar parts were done by Keith. At one point the sessions were halted when a buzzing noise was being picked up. Brian had fallen asleep and his guitar was leaning against a live amplifier. In a foreshadowing of things to come, they unplugged his guitar and carried on without him. During a tour in Europe, Mick was badly injured when a fan threw a chair at the stage. He went to the emergency ward and received 6 stitches. Brian's relationship with Anita Pallenberg was talked about at a time when London was known as the style capital of the world. They were the it couple, and this made Mick Jagger feel like his girlfriend was inadequate. Alan Klein had secured them the best record deal they could have imagined, but getting the money was a different matter. They had to beg for it. When Keith Richards needed a down payment for his country home, he sent the group's fix-it man Tom Keelock to Klein's office to get it. Keelock jumped over the counter and told a startled receptionist he wasn't leaving without Keith's cash. The drug consumption among the group also began to grow. Their handler would go into a drugstore, ask how many amyl nitrates, also known as poppers, were available and buy the lot. One night Keith and Brian met Bob Dylan in a nightclub. Dylan was touring the UK and being minded by Tom Keelock. They were extremely intoxicated at the time. Keelock later remembered, everyone overdid it. Keith accused Dylan of mocking the group with his song Like a Rolling Stone, and Dylan replied, I could have wrote Satisfaction, but no way you could have written Tambourine Man. Keith flew into a rage and Tom Keelock intervened, standing between the two. After that, Keelock and Dylan left the group, got into their car and headed back to their hotel. While Tom was driving, he saw a car in his mirror driving up fast behind. The car was doing about 80, weaving in and out of traffic. Looking closer, he recognised it was Brian's Rolls Royce. Keelock reached the hotel where he and Dylan stepped out. Keelock quickly hustled Dylan in as the Rolls Royce jumped the curb and nearly hit the entrance. Mick at this time was consumed with work, a constant stream of writing, performing and producing. He also had autographs to sign and interviews to give. Interviewers quizzed him on the meanings behind his lyrics. One asked, "What does I can't get no satisfaction mean?" Mick replied, "It means I can't get no satisfaction." Around this time, Alan Klein hired the group a yacht and the band had a press conference as they floated around New York Harbor. Keith moved into a 300-year-old timbered cottage known as Redlands. It was located in Sussex. The home was decorated with wolfskin rugs and brightly coloured bean bags. Keith was known to be extravagant and absent-minded. These two traits meant Tom Keelock was forever on a lost and found mission. He also helped Keith get his driving license, quite literally. Keith failed his test 3 times, and after the third, Tom Keelock went to the test centre, told them he was Keith, and took the test himself. Much to his delight, Brian was hired to write the soundtrack for the film A Degree of Murder. The finished product would be the closest thing to a solo album Jones fans would ever get. The Stones returned to the studio, keeping up their routine of recording from dusk till dawn. Tom Keelock had got used to these hours by now. Between the Buttons marked the beginning of the group's psychedelic period. Jones, as with the previous album, introduced new instruments to the songs. He had at this point become bored with the guitar. When the album was finished, Mick was disappointed with the recording. He liked the songs, but felt the production was lousy. It had in fact been produced by their manager Andrew Oldham. He later did an interview with the NME and stated the album was more or less rubbish. The album cover was taken the day after an all-night recording session. The group looked worse for wear, all except Keith, who looked exactly the same. Brian's appearance especially disturbed fans and critics. The photographer rubbed Vaseline around the lens, intending it to look like the group were dissolving into their surroundings. It didn't. It looked like someone had rubbed Vaseline around the lens. Around this time, while tripping in a hotel suite, Keith turned around to Brian and said, "You'll never make 30, man." To which Brian replied, "I know." Meanwhile, Alan Klein was publicly claiming the Stones would earn $7 million that year. That's the equivalent to $63 million in 2023. He also stated within the next 12 months they'd all be millionaires. At the same time, the Stones bookmaker was contacting Klein, begging him for £763. According to Tom Keelock, Mick and Keith were constantly saying they were skint. Bill Wyman had £23 in his bank account. The group appeared on the television show Saturday Night at the London Palladium. They were instructed to blow kisses and bid farewell cheers to the audience as the show ended. They refused. The show's producer told them they were insulting everything they stood for, and Mick told him to f*** off. The group played but received bad press for weeks later. As a result, Let's Spend the Night Together went gold. Not long after, Mick and Keith were questioned at Redlands. At the time, they were coming down from an acid trip. Keith Richards remarked, "Until that point, it had been one of the best days of his life." A convoy of police raided Redlands. No arrests were made that day, but that didn't stop their manager Andrew Oldham fleeing to America. He wasn't willing to take the risk. After the raid, things changed. It seemed they couldn't do what they wanted without repercussions anymore. Keith later stated that was when the fun stopped. Keith became more security conscious and asked Tom Keelock to build a 10-foot wall around the property. Tom Keelock wasn't a builder, but he knew one, and his name was Frank Thorogood. By early 1967, the Rolling Stones' excessive lifestyle was beginning to catch up with them. In March, Brian, Anita and Keith, with Tom Keelock, went on a trip to Morocco. One day, while drinking brandy and listening to an advanced copy of the Beatles' Strawberry Fields Forever, Brian Jones took a turn for the worse. He turned blue and was taken to hospital. There he was told he had an enlarged heart and advanced fatty degeneration of the liver. Brian stayed in the hospital and told Keith and Anita, "No problem, go ahead without me." This seemed a bad omen of things to come. When Brian recovered, he rejoined the group in Tangier. Keelock remembered, "The first I knew of Brian's arrival was the sound of his voice coming from a room along the corridor. He was screaming at Anita. Obviously, he knew something had gone on." Tom Keelock was referring to an affair Anita was now having with Keith. Brian began drinking heavily and his mood turned for the worse. Keith and Anita decided to leave the hotel and head back to England while Brian was out shopping. When he returned, he found a note explaining they'd gone. At first he flew into a rage and then fell down in a stupor. Keith later stated, "Brian never forgave me after that, and I don't blame him." Brian turned up at a friend's house the next day looking dishevelled, without any money, and simply stated, "They left me." Brian immediately began a relationship with Linda Keith, Keith Richards' former girlfriend. Brian attended the film premiere of A Degree of Murder, intending to win Anita back. It didn't work, and that night the two had a fight in a hotel room with the pair hitting each other. The hotel manager knocked on the door complaining of the noise, and after a volatile row, Brian threw a punch connecting and the two brawled in the hallway. Nobody in the band was talking to Brian at this time, and fearing the group would split, Mick reminded them the band would lose their entire Decca advance should they break up. Not long after, Brian was busted on drug charges. The details of the group's time in court and prison are documented on my documentary, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards' Turbulent Years. Though it is worth noting, the newspaper article, Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel, was very influential in changing public opinion. The article argued the Stones' incarceration was unnecessary. At this time, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had been released and changed the direction of music. The hippie movement was in full swing, and the Stones made a transition into psychedelia. They bought bright, psychedelically coloured clothes and grew their hair out. Their previous album, Between the Buttons, had been a transitional record. Not entirely blues, but not what you'd call a psychedelic album. The group's next album, Their Satanic Majesties' Request, completely abandoned their previous sound. The group's next single, We Love You, was written as a thank you for their fans' support during their recent arrests. The new psychedelic sound surprised fans and critics. Brian missed early sessions due to being hospitalised for a nervous breakdown, but was released in time to complete the song. In the music video, Brian can be seen struggling to stay awake and looking disorientated. John Lennon believed the song was a direct copy of All You Need Is Love.
Satanic Majesties is Pepper. We love them, man. It's the most bullshit. That's all you need is love.
The members of the group dismissed the statement, claiming they'd been working on We Love You for some time. The title, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, was a play on the words Her Britannic Majesty Requests, which appears in a British passport to this day. The album was produced by the band themselves and took almost a year to record. It had begun just after Behind the Buttons was released. The whole project was a mess. Bill Wyman later stated, "Every day at the studio it was a lottery as to who would turn up and what, if any, positive contribution they would make when they did. Brian was in his element. His experimental instruments filled the album. Ultimately though, as Keith Richards later noted, none of us wanted to make it." Bill Wyman wrote the song Acid in the Grass for the album, and the title was later changed to In Another Land. The other group members secretly recorded him snoring and added it to the end of the song. He didn't know this though until the album was released. All the other songs, as usual, were written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. When the album cover was taken, the band were high on acid. As they sat down and posed, Mick Jagger remembered feeling like he was back at school. The original cover was a 3D image that when moved, you could see the band members turn to look at each other. It was very expensive to do, and the cover was soon changed to a still photograph. Inside, the album contains an unsolvable maze on one side and a collage of pictures on the other. On release, their Satanic Majesties did very well, quickly going gold. Though some countries refused to sell the album with the word Satanic in the title. In South Africa and the Philippines, it was released as The Stones Are Rolling. Critically, the album was seen as just a Sgt. Pepper's rip-off and nothing more. I personally believe the sudden change in direction shocked their fans and it never got a fair review. The Beatles had eased into their psychedelic masterpiece over the course of 2 albums, but the Stones had gone full psychedelia overnight. Sadly, the Stones regretted making the album and now act as if it doesn't exist. One day in late 1967, Keith held a party at Redlands. At one point during the night, the guests decided to swim around Keith's moat. Brian was there very drunk and he jumped in. Tom Keelock observed everyone swimming around, but Brian had stopped moving. He jumped in and dragged Brian out, only to find it was a joke. The next time Brian would be motionless in water, there would be no one to save him. After numerous visits by the emergency services, Brian was evicted from his flat. His landlord threw all of his possessions into the road. Brian was not legally able to tour America, and Mick worried about the financial repercussions. Jones at this time was living on a diet of brandy, acid and pills. He was often seen by fans wobbling to the liquor store in his Afghan coat. Tom Keelock remembered, "It was hard work being friends with Brian. You needed to be there for him 24 hours a day." Brian was 2 people, one shy and caring, the other cruel and unpleasant, and the 2 halves tried to control one another. When he'd stood trial, his therapist took the stand and described him as deeply disturbed, paranoid, and spoke about his fragile grasp of reality. When he was arrested and taken to prison, Tom Keelock stated, "I saw Brian being taken across the yard. I felt desperately sorry for him that day." Meanwhile, Keith was listening to new records, sat at Redlands and developed a taste for country music. He messed around with country tunings and slide guitar, while his new builder Frank Thorogood knocked down walls in the next room. Keith sat rolling joints with the HM prison rolling papers he still had. Redlands had become a chaotic place. When Frank Thorogood first arrived to start work, he said it was like stepping off the planet. At this time, Keith was suffering the effects of hepatitis C and a doctor prescribed him some medicine. Keith has since claimed his immune system is so powerful he cured himself of hepatitis C. Meanwhile, the group were receiving the good news, bad news line. Their Satanic Majesties had earned them their biggest royalties, but worse reviews. Around this time, Mick Jagger, who had studied at the London School of Economics, was becoming distrustful of Alan Klein's profit participation. Not only that, Klein had begun working with the Beatles, and it was felt that they were getting most of his attention. By 1968, Brian Jones had gained weight and bought a mansion in West Sussex called Cotchford Farm. The place needed renovation work done, and Tom Keelock knew just the person to do it. Mick and Keith, meanwhile, were at Redlands working on what would become Street Fighting Man. Instead of Keith's distinctive electric guitar, he recorded his acoustic guitar on a tape player, then turned the volume up to full. It had a unique sound, something crossed between electric and acoustic. With the failure of Satanic Majesties, the group had decided to go back to their blues roots. The psychedelic scene never sat comfortably with them, Keith especially.
It didn't really answer particularly to what Keith Richards was about. Keith Richards was not George Harrison.
Their next single, Jumping Jack Flash, exploded, hitting number 1 in the US and the UK. Mick and Keith were pleased. Bill Wyman, on the other hand, was not. He'd originally written the iconic riff on piano and would never receive any royalties for arguably the Stones' greatest song. It has been speculated Street Fighting Man, as well as I Can't Get No Satisfaction, was inspired by William Blake's poem The Mental Traveller. During the sessions for their next album Beggar's Banquet, Brian can be seen completely detached from the band. In the footage he seems intoxicated and disorientated. The album's producer Jimmy Miller recalled Brian only turning up when he felt like it. One time Brian bought his guitar to record, but it was completely irrelevant to what songs they were working on. Miller would put him in an isolated booth and not hit record. Mick and Keith would later say to Miller, "Just tell him to piss off and get out of here." Despite this, Brian's contributions end up on almost every track. Keith provided all the lead and most of the rhythm to the album. When the record was complete, Mick had the perfect idea to promote the album. He'd always loved going to the Circus, and with director Michael Lindsay Hogg, came up with the idea of incorporating rock music. They would invite other bands to play with a live audience watching and record it all on film. The night before, Brian refused to perform. He stated, "Mick and Keith are picking on me," and told Michael Lindsay Hogg, "I hate the Rolling Stones." After a lengthy conversation, he agreed to perform. The recording began at a TV studio on Wickham Road in London. Performances began at 2 p.m. and went on until 5 a.m. the next morning. By that time, the audience and the Rolling Stones were exhausted. Brian was so intoxicated he couldn't tune his guitar. His hands trembled as he played. After all the effort, Mick was so disappointed in the Stones' performance, he cancelled the TV airing. The footage remained unused for years. Some of it, thought to have been destroyed, was found in the bin at the Who's private film vault. Soon after, Brian visited Morocco with Suki Portier. At one point, he blacked out and fell to the floor. When a friend asked, "What do we do?" Suki replied, "Nothing, it happens all the time." 2 months after, Frank Thorogood was hired to start work on Brian's mansion, formerly owned by Winnie the Pooh writer A.A. Milne. One night, after drinking with his builder, his girlfriend, and a nurse sent to look after him, Brian was discovered motionless at the bottom of his pool. Side note, I go into his death with great detail, including the conspiracy theories in my documentary, Midnight Rambler, The Life and Mysterious Death of Brian Jones. When he was first pulled out, he still had a pulse, but by the time the ambulance arrived, he was pronounced dead. The autopsy showed his liver and heart were greatly enlarged. Jones' body was buried 10 foot deep to prevent grave robbers. Bill Wyman later stated, "While the Rolling Stones damaged all of us in some way, Brian was the only one that died." Back in 1968, Mick Jagger had starred in his first film. He played a drugged-out rock star living in isolation with his girlfriend, who was played by Anita Pallenberg. Mick based the character on Brian Jones. After all, it pretty much was. Keith, who was now in a relationship with Anita, became paranoid the two were sleeping together on set. He worried Mick would steal Anita off him like he stole her off Brian. With images of the two together, Keith sat writing the opening riff and words to "Gimme Shelter." The opening lyrics read, "Oh, a storm is threatening my very life today." Keith had become a real workhorse at this point. With Brian's input decreasing, he needed to be. The producers of Performance rented Keith and Anita a flat to stay in. They were still living there long after the film wrapped up. When it was time to move on, Keith bought a place just down the road from Mick. He was working on Let It Bleed, and the idea was, living in such close quarters, he and Mick would get more work done. Bill Wyman purchased Gedding Hall in Suffolk. The house dated back to 1458 and was formerly owned by a Cray Brothers associate and said to be haunted by a Victorian actress. At this time, the Stones' bookkeeper was sending Alan Klein messages that read, "Alan, what the fuck is happening? Where are Mick's checks?" The messages went on to say that solicitors are screaming for the balance of Bill's money before adding, "What about Brian's 6,000? It turns out the 1.2 million Klein had negotiated back in 1965 at the Decca meeting had not been paid into the Stones' account. It was paid into an offshore company with Klein as the president. For their next album, Let It Bleed, Brian's contribution was almost non-existent. In one session, he laid down some drum tracks for the track Midnight Rambler. At one point, he missed the drums and fell back onto an amp, which in turn hit another amp, and so on. Everything fell down like a stack of dominoes. No one even reacted, apart from Charlie, who muttered, "Bad luck." The next take, Brian dropped his cigarette on his shirt, tripped over a guitar lead, and smashed his head on a pillar. Keith eventually lost patience and marched out of the studio. Mick stated, "If Brian doesn't perform tonight, he's out the band." After this, Brian checked himself into rehab once again. He was now in a relationship with a Swedish model named Anna Wolin. Anna, others noted, looked the spitting image of Anita Pallenberg. One time at Cotchford Farm, much to Anna's annoyance, Brian stated, "Doesn't she look like Anita?" Tom Keelock, as it happened, liked Anna very much. The reason for this probably being she didn't use drugs. Mick and Keith, though frustrated with Brian, were also worried about him too. The sense that he needed to be looked after was on everyone's mind. There was talk of flying in a record producer known as Phil Kaufman to look after him full time, but this never came to fruition. Keith told Tom Keelock to deliver roses to Brian whenever he seemed down. The rose bills ran up very quickly. At this point, Keith's drug intake was the highest it had ever been. He'd take pills for breakfast and throughout the day. He was so wrecked at the rock and roll circus, even Brian, who was intoxicated himself, was shocked at his condition. Brian later said he'd never seen Keith as high as he'd been that day. Ironically, Brian believed Keith didn't have much longer to live. In March of 1969, Brian Jones began to believe he didn't have long left to live. His ill health no doubt was the reason. His liver and heart were both enlarged. He told his friends the end was near and began planning his funeral. He repeatedly told his friend and builder Frank Thorogood he wanted to be buried, not burned. He even told Tom Keelock exactly where he wanted to be buried, near the statues of Winnie the Pooh. The coffin, he said, had to be lined with a precise shade of blue. He'd walked past an undertaker's shop window previously and took a liking to the colour. When his parents came to visit, he laid down photographs, newspapers and other personal items for when he was gone. Frank Thorogood was in the room and watched Brian's parents go through the items with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Frank at this time was living in a flat located on the premises. Brian had asked his parents to move in previously and they'd politely refused. The last contribution to a Stone song Brian made was on the track You Got the Silver. He sat in the corner playing the auto harp. The song was a love letter from Keith to Anita. Thorogood described Brian as badly depressed during this period. He stated that for a cocky rock star, he harboured enormous insecurities and fears. Brian and Frank sat drinking the nights away. When they talked, Brian always asked about Frank's family. He would say, "Oh Frank, you must bring your daughter down." Frank stated, "Despite everything you read, I got to like him a lot. When you were alone with Brian over a bottle of wine, he was just this shy kid. A group of builders came down from London, all expecting to hate the cocky rock star they'd heard about. Frank stated they all went away thinking he was the nicest guy in the world." A few weeks later, Keith smashed up his Mercedes convertible while doing 70 miles an hour. Anita was in the passenger seat and heavily pregnant at the time. She broke her collarbone in the crash and Keith walked away uninjured. After hiding their drugs in the branches of a nearby oak tree, the pair checked into hospital. The day after the crash, Mick and Keith had the Brian situation to attend to. They spent some time in the studio and then drove to Cotchford Farm, arriving at 7 p.m. Brian had been anxious about their meeting, so he'd been steadily drinking throughout the day. Mick told Brian things weren't working out and they planned to continue without him. Keith stated he wasn't surprised. I don't think he even took it all in. There was no serious way we could go on the road with Brian. Brian reminded the group it was him who first came up with the name Rolling Stones, and his girlfriend Anna Wolin, who was upstairs, reported hearing shouting. A settlement was agreed. Brian would receive £20,000 for every year the group lasted. That's the equivalent of £167,000 in 2023. In the following days, Brian sat around drinking Blue Nun, watching television. With Brian's dismissal from the band, fears about his mental state were at an all-time high. Tom Keelock sent Janet Lawson, a nurse, to watch over him. The day of Brian's death, reports claim Brian and Frank got into an argument about money. But neither Wolin nor Lawson saw any such argument occur. So unless they both went to the toilet for an argument, it's unlikely it happened. Also, reports that Brian owed Frank money or that Frank had been fired were false. Thorogood later stated it was cobblers, saying, "I was paid by the Stones office, not by Brian, and in those days I had more work than I needed. Much as I liked Brian, he was just another part-time client." Due to the cold weather, Brian had the pool temperature rise to what police described as an average to hot bath. He was drinking and taking pills, and after the 7th brandy, Brian wobbled his way across the diving board and jumped in. The way he hit the water caused his 2 Afghan hounds to bark, and the wrestling match they'd been watching on television echoed through the French doors. Janet Lawson later stated, "Brian and Frank were in no condition to swim. I wanted to disassociate myself from them." The last words she heard Brian say were, "I love this place," as he floated around the deep end of the pool. Frank at one point got out the pool and headed to get a cigarette from the house. He told Brian, "I'm going in," and heard Brian grunt in response. Janet Lawson headed out to check on Brian and saw him motionless at the bottom of the pool. She let out a scream that brought everyone outside. She stated, "Something has happened to Brian," before Anita dove into the pool and pulled him to the surface. He still had a pulse when pulled out the water, and Anna claims she felt him squeeze her hand. Despite this, when the ambulance arrived, he was pronounced dead. In my view, the official verdict is the most plausible one. The deathbed confession was debunked by Frank's daughter, who said, "Tom Keelock never spent any time alone with Frank, and Frank didn't know he was dying when he was admitted to the hospital, so he didn't know he was giving a deathbed confession." Frank didn't stand to gain anything from Brian's death. In fact, rumours plagued him for years, and he lost a lot of work due to it. When Frank died at 67, he was heavily in debt. The Stones were recording at Olympic Studios when they got a phone call through. "Brian's dead," said the voice on the phone. Keith felt more shocked than surprised. Mick contacted Frank Thorogood to get the details. Mick feared Brian was depressed and had killed himself like he'd threatened to do many times before. In Keith's book Life, he seemed to be in two minds about Brian's death. He could see Brian being so obnoxious that someone would hold his head underwater to scare him, and Brian was intoxicated and in very poor health, so either scenario wouldn't surprise him. Mick later stated, "Brian drowned in his pool. The other stuff is people trying to make money." 2 days later, the Stones held a free concert in Hyde Park. The concert was originally intended to introduce their new guitarist Mick Taylor. After Brian's death, the event was changed to a tribute in his honour. Fans arrived with candles, and Mick entered the stage wearing a white dress and read a poem. Tom Keelock and his crew let out butterflies from cardboard boxes. Most of the butterflies had died in the heat, and that, as they say, was that. During this time, the band's contract with Decca was due to expire. Unbeknownst to Alan Klein, Mick was negotiating to take control of the Stones' finances. Brian was buried 5 days later. He got the blue silk-lined coffin he'd wanted. Mourners gathered at the church Brian sang as a choir boy. Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg did not attend the funeral.